Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be chatting about the book The Bewitching by Silvia Moreno Garcia. Typically I would just discuss this book within a new fantasy releases wrap-up, as even though it is more definitively considered horror rather than fantasy, one, I think there's a lot of overlap in the readership between fantasy and horror, but also because I do feel like a lot of the components that are explored within horror stories do still fit under the umbrella of fantasy, and thus there's a lot of understandable overlap, not just in readership but also in the things that are within the books and the kinds of things that the authors dip their toes in. For example, someone like T. Kingfisher does seem to hop back and forth between horror and fantasy. That said, there were certain things within this book that I felt like there was no way I could properly talk about it without getting into spoilers. So all of today's video essentially is going to be spoiler filled. If this is a book that you're wanting to check out and you don't want to know anything ahead of time, then definitely click off. But if you want to stick around for some chatting, then do that. Then stick around. Jumping straight into it, part of why I felt like this book I had to get into the specifics is because of the very nature of what led me to feel the way I felt about the conclusion of the story, which obviously you can't talk about the conclusion if you're trying to remain spoiler-free. But I'll dive first into the setup behind this. So this is a multi-generational story where there are 3 different timelines. And I did really enjoy how this author utilized multiple timelines. I can be very picky when it comes to multi-generational types of stories, as typically I find the thing that is connecting all of these is something to do with a family. And I end up wanting to dive deeper into individual members of said family, and I don't often feel like we get enough of that. I can feel as though we're just getting a bird's eye view. However, I do feel like she utilized the multiple timelines to not only inform the present day and the different characters and how they're connected, but also the culmination of everything and how everything comes to a head in this very climactic ending. I felt like how all of that played out was done quite well. It's not, for me, my favorite example of this, but because it can be so challenging to pull off, I did want to compliment that I feel like she wove everything together in a way that kept me on my toes, and I was very interested to see how everything would connect. But the idea is that you have these 3 different timelines. We have the past, where we're following a young girl named Alva, and then we have her granddaughter in present day. Her granddaughter has grown up hearing the stories of her grandmother who survived some kind of encounter with a witch, and she has told her granddaughter stories. Her granddaughter's name is Minerva, and having heard these stories growing up, it definitely impacted her, and it created this fascination with witches and anything to do with the horror genre. So now she is in an academic setting and she is studying a lot to do with various different horror writers that were really impactful to the genre. And within this story, there is an author who is very well known and has kind of created a cult following after writing a book called The Vanishing. And our character Minerva discovers that The Vanishing was actually inspired by the real life disappearance of one of the author's friends. However, very little is known about this, and so our character is making it part of her thesis to try and research this more, to not only research what happened, but see if she can discover a little bit more about the person that went missing and how it impacted the story itself. So while you have these 2 perspectives that are very clearly tied together by the fact that they are family members, you also have another perspective that is the author whose friend went missing and kind of the relaying of the information of what happened at that time. So there's some kind of mystery there, and then there's going to be some kind of witch component in the past, and then very strange things start happening in Minerva's present day plotline, and she seems somewhat a little bit more capable and in the know because of the things her grandmother has taught her, but it's not obviously exactly the same, and it seems somehow connected to the things that she is reading about. So everything is in some fashion connected and interwoven. Even though I appreciated how everything came together, unfortunately there wasn't any one particular character who I found myself drawn to. Everybody is fairly unlikable in this story, and certainly you can have a book where you are showcasing pretty much exclusively unlikable characters. For example, Joe Abercrombie does this all the time. And also a story that utilizes the fractured timeline and almost multi-generational feel is something like Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil by V. Schwab, or if you truly want a fractured timeline by the same author, you have Vicious. And so I do like when authors play around with that to keep you on your toes and keep you guessing, but I have found that oftentimes there's some level of, even if I despise the characters or even if I recognize that they're not the most likable of people, there tends to be something, though, that keeps me either rooting for them or really sucked into what's going to happen next because I want them to succeed, even if I think they're bad, quote unquote, in some fashion. And in this story, I certainly didn't think that they deserved the bad things that ended up happening to them whatsoever. It's not like I was thinking, who cares if you die or something like that. But I didn't really find they were the most compelling of characters. I do wish I could have rooted for them a little bit more, but they felt like vehicles to serve some of the thematic elements or the plot. And so I do wish I could have had a little bit more connection to them, but part of the actual plot side of things I was invested in, and I would say I was the most invested in the plot of The Past. And this is where some of the disturbing elements of the story come into play, and not necessarily disturbing in a horror element kind of way, although there is this featured in other horror stories as well. But the disturbing element that came into play in The Past was incest. So, in The Past, in Alva's perspective, the grandmother of Minerva, who is in present day, in the past, you have Alva as a young girl who, her family is decently well off. They own a decent amount of land. And after the patriarch of the family, the father, has died, her brother, who is only 10 months older than her, is now thrust into this parental role, if you will. He's trying to take care of his siblings while also trying to help his mother, who is now a grieving widow. And he takes this upon himself with a lot of pride because he does care about this land and he does value his family and he cares about all of them and he's trying his best, but it's a difficult position he's being put in. And cue their uncle entering the scene, and he comes along and he's just such a refined man and he's handsome and he knows all about poetry. Alva is very taken with him. She just thinks he's the perfect example of what a man can be. And even though their family is decently well off, she doesn't really like the rural life and she wishes she could be whisked off into this area where things would be so much nicer. She views what would be nicer as some kind of life that is associated with, in some fashion, what her uncle represents, and some of what he represents turns into this almost twisted attraction, if you will. And I want to make very clear that given some of the spoiler things that occur, I think it's fair to say in hindsight, Alva may have been bewitched, hence the title. And so you do very quickly see that not only is she somewhat taken with her uncle, but her uncle seems into her. And you're like, oh, wait, what? That's her uncle, though. So you right away are like, this guy is weird. And he keeps trying to push the brother to sell the land because he is insisting that it's not going to produce enough money to take care of them. And he's just going to run everything into the ground. Their family's going to be destitute. And he's trying to push them to sell. He also is very dismissive of all of these pagan people and these dumb peasants, and he's constantly talking about how everybody is so stupid and uneducated and so much better in Mexico City, and he's the worst. He's awful. And very quickly you're like, if he's not the bad guy, I guess that's the twist, but like, he's the bad guy, right? I mean, even if he wasn't, right away you're like, well, at the very least he's creepy with her, so that makes him bad regardless of whether he's the big bad or not. But either way, what ends up happening is you discover that, in fact, he is a warlock, and it would seem he has possibly bewitched his niece. Maybe that's why she has all of these feelings for him that are strange. But he also wants to have a relationship with his niece. Part of what he's hoping for and getting the family to sell the farm is that then he can hire on the niece to help him in his home and basically be like a homemaker. But clearly he's planning on also being romantically involved with his niece, and this is sort of just the catalyst to get that. And so you're like, okay, this guy's gross. He's super disgusting. But you recognize immediately that this guy is disgusting. So it's kind of odd in that I never really was on the edge of my seat in the sense that I was unsure who the villain was in the past. I knew, because the first interaction with him, you're like, this guy's a creeper. Can you get him away from here, please? You know immediately. And then, of course, strange things start happening. The brother goes missing. This young man who is very taken with Alva, who seems like he wants to possibly marry her someday, he's killed very brutally. And you're like, okay, it has to be the uncle. It has to be the uncle. And then what do you know? It is the uncle, right? So the uncle is disturbed and gross, and he's using his powers to try and get what he can out of his niece and the family's land and property. That's the past. I did predict very quickly what was going down with all of that, and so it lacked suspense in the sense that I didn't get to have the opportunity of what's going on. It's certainly not a mystery. And he's so gross right from the start, and her feelings for him are so odd that you wonder if there's more going on, if there's more at play. You do have a sense of, it feels as though you're meant to figure it out right away. In T. Kingfisher's A Sorceress Comes to Call, you know right off the bat that the main character's mother is a sorceress. It's not a mystery. However, other people don't know this. And so when other people say something and it's clearly bothering the sorceress, because you know what she's capable of, you immediately start thinking, please shut up, don't piss her off, because if you piss her off, she could very quickly make you violently harm yourself. Please stop. So you kind of are filled with dread anytime the littlest thing starts to happen. And it was different in this, in that you kind of know that things are going to take a dark turn, but you haven't been shown what he's capable of just yet. You just kind of get told, like, then this is missing, and there's a weird sound outside the house. And I think if I'm going to know right away that there is a bad player, I kind of want to know exactly what they're capable of up front, so that I'm more, I guess you could say, fearful. Because if I'm picking up a horror story, I want to be afraid. And I don't know that I was ever afraid. I just thought he was gross. And he's gross in a sadly kind of realistic way. Not that I'm saying realistic in that, like, our uncles, right? Not in that way. But I mean, there are people that are awful human beings and that are predatory in this fashion. And that's a very real world thing. And I suppose, obviously, horror stories can have these frightening real world things associated with them, but it made it so that the paranormal elements almost weren't necessary, because the real life predatory nature of this person was disturbing enough. And I thought that we could have done more with the paranormal side of things. Now cue, though, present day, where we do start to present day, and also as we are learning about what happened in this inspiration for a manuscript that Minerva in present day is studying. So the way that these two timelines are working is that in present day, Minerva is studying after she gets permission from this elderly woman who is very, very rich, and she cares very much about family legacy. And this elderly woman allows Minerva to look into the notes of said author whose friend went missing. In fact, the old woman also knew the girl who went missing, who was the inspiration for a novel that created a cult following. So Minerva, she gets this opportunity. The old lady, pretty quickly you're like, okay, there's a little too much concern with the, I have to ensure my bloodline continues on, that we breed well. So you're like, that old lady's a weirdo. And you kind of, at least for me, pretty quickly, I'm like, I don't know, I feel like there's something up with this old lady. And Minerva, as she's discovering more about what happened, you find out that this girl who was very spiritual and was seen as weird, but somewhat likable and eccentric, this girl that went missing, they didn't really investigate her much, because they were like, she's a silly, flighty lady, because this occurred in the time of the Great Depression, and women were not taken very seriously, so they didn't really take her seriously when she disappeared, because of the fact that they just decided, well, she's very flighty and very strange. And then, like, one time she interacted with this seemingly perfectly nice Portuguese man, and they were like, well, he's Portuguese, so he's ethnic, and why would we investigate further? He probably just took her and murdered her. Case closed. Like, they weren't interested in looking into it, because they weren't high society types. And it also seems like the old woman, given that she's a high society type, you're like, I don't really think you cared either. In fact, it seems like maybe you were involved in the disappearance. And then cue the final conclusion, where it's discovered, yes, indeed, she was involved. In fact, she's a witch, and she ate that girl. And this is where the story for me, while I appreciated how everything came to a head, and the timing of it and the pacing of it, because in the past, when everything is happening with the warlock and he's finally shown himself to be the person pulling the strings and he is making his moves on the niece and it's disgusting and awful, and she's trying to push back and figure out how to kill him and end him finally end him once and for all. While that's happening, also Minerva is discovering that the old woman was the witch who led to the disappearance of the girl in the notes. So we're going back and forth between the two, and we're seeing how the warlock was defeated by Alva informs how Minerva is now going to go up against this old woman. But I was a little surprised by the motivations of the old woman, because in the past, we saw that the uncle was just disgusting and power hungry and wanted control, which to some degree the old woman wants control too. She wants control over her family's legacy, and she has a grandson. You find out at the end she's pretty much the one responsible for killing her own child and his partner. And then she figured, okay, now that they're out of the way, I can raise the grandson the way I feel he should be raised, because my father raised me to be this powerful witch, and I want to now do that with my grandson. Except for she thinks her grandson is such a loser that she's like, okay, I'm old. I'm in my 80s. I need a good 20 more years. I'm going to make sure that he marries well, and then he has a kid, and then maybe I'll kill him too, and then I can raise the baby. And once that happens, then I can finally peace out. And in order to have enough power to ensure that she lasts another 20 or so years, she wants to eat Minerva, because Minerva, she realizes this girl has some power, and if I eat her, that will give me more sustenance than if I just ate some random person. So that's perfect. And it was the same kind of situation back in the past. Her father's business wasn't doing super well, so they ate the one spiritual girl, and that helped their business and their family legacy and all those things. So now in present day, that's her plan for Minerva. But a little bit, I was like, why did you let Minerva start looking through the notes? She knows right away, because the way that she figured out that Minerva was powerful is because oftentimes you can feel it if you touch the person, like a handshake or something. And at the beginning of the story, because she's an elderly woman, when she goes to pour something and she's struggling, Minerva helps her, and it's through that contact that the old lady realizes, like, oh, this one will be a nice, yummy snack for me. And then I was like, why did you keep letting Minerva start to kind of figure out what happened in the past and who might have been responsible if you were planning on just eating her anyway? Like, I guess in the same way I was describing, okay, now that I know who the threat is and I know what's possible, then maybe just let me have that information and then fill me with dread sooner? Because a little bit, I'm like, this old lady's dumb. Why didn't she just eat her sooner, or try to eat her sooner before Minerva could have been clued in? Because throughout the present day timeline, not only is Minerva discovering more about what happened with the girl that went missing, she also keeps experiencing weird witchy things. The cat that comes along, the stray cat that she feeds sometimes is suddenly dead, and she's like, oh no, this is so sad, and weird stuff is happening like that. And so a little bit I'm like, why? I mean, it mirrors what's going on in her grandmother's timeline, but at least in her grandmother's timeline, the villain, the uncle, like, he had plans to keep the niece around because he was gross and he wanted to basically marry her, or at the very least, maybe not marry, but have her live with him so he could do stuff with her. So it's like he had an end goal, and it would make sense that he wouldn't just kill her outright if he wants her around. But in present day, I'm like, well, the old lady's planning to eat you, so why not just eat you immediately as soon as she finds out? I'm like, well, just kill her now. And she's very powerful. She's super powerful. She can make people, she's kind of like eye flutters and her eyes go back in her head, and she's like, I see your friend driving, and it would just be so tragic if he just took a wrong turn and crashed. And so you're like, okay, so this lady's got definitely a lot of powers. I guess I just feel like this old lady's kind of dumb. I mean, she's dumb for the obvious, like, caring about family legacy and things like that. She sucks in that way, obviously. But I'm also like, she's not very bright. And it's funny because she does, highlight how dumb she thinks her grandson is all the time. I'm like, yeah, but you're pretty dumb too. So, apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, I guess. But then the whole story ends with Minerva talking to after killing the old lady. So old lady gets killed, creepy uncle gets killed. Sadly, this is sort of justice for the girl that went missing because the person that was responsible is the old lady. So that poor girl didn't have a chance. But justice for her all around. You are dealing with the witches of the story. But once that witch is dead, then at the end of the story, there's an interaction between Minerva and the old lady's grandson, who just seems like this kind of, it's sad, but he is kind of a loser. I mean, he doesn't try at all. He doesn't apply himself. He kind of just gets drunk and is drifting around wherever because his family has money. So you feel kind of bad, but also you're like, I mean, come on, man. Anyway, so there's this last interaction between him and Minerva where they're just chit-chatting, and then he is kind of sort of trying to invite himself in, and she's just like, I'll see you later, and she leaves, and it kind of leaves off with a, you never know, he could also be bad, and also you should never allow a witch into your house, and then that's kind of how it ends. And I wasn't really ever scared, which is not the only reason to pick up horror stories. There are plenty of things that horror stories can do, and there's a lot of commentary they can provide that is really valuable, whether or not you're scared. Regardless, I mean, that valuable things can still be there. I do think that the story had such a cool approach to witches, because so often when we see witches in stories, we don't get to see the version that we saw here, the kind that is inspired by, in this case, the sorts of things that are within brujas, that kind of a witch, as opposed to, a pointy hat and I'm brewing potions instead of that kind of witch. So the cultural aspect of things was awesome. And also just the idea that they're almost vampire-like and they're truly terrifying. So they're so powerful and they are disturbing. That aspect of this was great. I complimented that I feel like it's very difficult to weave all these different plot lines together, and there were definitely threads connecting things, and the pacing of how everything came together was good. The writing style, while currently I wouldn't say there was a very, very strong authorial voice because the writing was sort of dependent on who you were with, I still thought that the writing style kept me engaged at the very least, and that it was easy to follow. I always was kind of kept in the loop, and it made me curious as to what was going to happen next. But I don't read a lot of horror. I do have a tendency to pick up fantasy and sometimes fantasy horror, or the types of authors that bounce back and forth between fantasy and horror, so I have some experience with it. But when I was diving into something that is formally considered a horror story, I thought I would have a different experience, I guess, with it. And this one was, it was fine. There were things it was going for that I appreciated being present, but I wanted a little bit more out of it. And maybe it's one of those situations where because the pacing was quite fast, that it didn't allow for some of the, let's just sit in the discomfort and let's sit in this what's going to happen next and this dread. I actually think I like when we sit in that a little bit more. I think a good example of this is in Grave Empire by Richard Swan. There's some really disturbing people in that. There's some really disturbing things happening. There's bizarre things happening. And you were like, what the heck is going on? Oh my gosh. And I like that sitting in the dread, which I don't know that we got as much of. But it's a balancing act, because if we'd had that, it might have moved a little slower. I think it might have been harder to pull off the 3 timelines. But at the end of the day, I think the scariest part about this book was not really the witch element. It was that the uncle's so gross. The uncle's so gross. This book, at the very least, was an experience. And so I thought I would chat about it with all of you. And if you've picked it up, let me know your thoughts. And if you haven't picked it up, but you felt like sticking around for the spoiler chat, then let me know if you're going to read the book now, because I'd be very curious. And also, if you have any horror recommendations, let me know. I haven't, as I said, picked up that much, and the couple of things that I've picked up that are formally categorized as horror, I've had some interesting experiences with. I picked up a Grady Hendrix book, and to this day, it is one of the funniest things I've ever read, but I don't know if that was supposed to be the takeaway I got. Like, I recognize that Grady Hendrix often uses humor, and it's borderline satirical, but also the way in which it made me laugh was maybe not exactly the thing that I was supposed to come away from it with. Let's just say the diner thing was so funny to me. It was Oh my gosh. So anyway, if you have any recommendations for some horror stories, feel free to let me know. If you have some horror fantasy recommendations, feel free to let me know. And as I said, if you have thoughts on this book, let me know that too. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later.